So, just a little bit about growing up with Art as your older brother. Whatever you want to talk about, or
He
skip.
was an incredible, intrepid, a wonderful athlete, unbelievable.
Really?
Wonderful athlete. He, at 5'8" or 5'7", he was a great basketball player at a time just prior to when you couldn't be a basketball player if you weren't 6'7" or anything like that. He toured with a semi-pro basketball team, the Jewels, and he toured Brooklyn and played in Bushwick and Williamsburg and others, and he was a star. He was also a good baseball catcher, aggressive, terrific, and wonderful. He was a leader, and I followed where he went and what he did, and always a little bit in the shadow. He was really the hero of my age. We were lucky, both of us, when our father died, to have my Uncle Max, who was my mother's brother, who was wonderful. He was the exemplar of what an uncle should be, and he made me a good uncle. His wife, who was a pinch little snotty, upper-class German Jewish, not particularly Jewish, but Germanic lady, hated that he spent time with us, would forbid him to come, and he would, not openly, but he would come every Saturday and spend lunch with us. He would take us shopping. He would be the male in our environment, the closest uncle the entire stretch. And he lived about 20 minutes away from where we were. He was a successful diamond merchant, and he was just a funny, wonderful, he loved his sister, and he was great. He helped us tide over what we went through when my father died. Art goes into the Army in very early part of World War II, gets trained in various places in the United States, and then gets shipped out to Burma, to the Chinese-Burma border, where he's with Chiang Kai-shek as a Chinese nationalist, and General Wainwright and Stilwell, and he was a radio operator in the Air Force, but he was the chaplain's assistant on Jewish things. He got interested in musicals. He would do all kinds of, he was a very involved, intensive, aggressive young guy in that. He comes back after the war, and he's got the Bill of Rights, and he says, you better get in there, but we can't afford you to go to college. So I go into the Army at 17 and a half, and I spend a little over 2 years here, but never overseas. There's no war. The World War II is over, and the Korean War didn't begin yet. I went to 3 basic trainings, not because I failed, I was very good, but a bunch of crazy things happened. And thanks to a one-eyed Irishman who was anti-Semitic in a Judaic way, which is he loved what all the calumnies that people said about Jews, money grubbing, cheating, lying. He wanted to learn how to do that. And he hung around with us, and he was always hanging around the orderly room to see what's happening. We're finishing up training in Aberdeen, Maryland, 3 hours from New York, waiting to finish and go to small arms repair school, and we're going to go home. And he suddenly sees a memo that says, if you have any background in medicine, you can sign up and you will get special treatment in the medical corps. So he signs up, but he doesn't want to be alone. So he signs up 10 of his friends, unbeknownst to them. And we all get shipped out to Texas. At the end of our basic training, we're not going home. We're not 3 hours from New York. We're a day and a half in Texas, in San Antonio, Texas. And that's how I got into the medical corps, medical department, or whatever they called it. I went to X-ray school. We were supposed to then graduate and go to Tokyo to be part of General MacArthur's detachment. We never went. I spent my time at Fort Sam Houston, Madigan General Hospital in Fort Lewis, Washington, and I came home. Art was now in NYU. He'd become a dedicated leftist. He's never a communist. He always said that he cheated them out of their dues, but he was a dedicated, and he spent about 6 months beating me out of my liberalism. And don't you understand what they do? And finally I became a leftist. And my education was, as I told you, in the dining room of the Commons, where all we were doing is arguing Stalinism, communism, NYU, that time in Washington Square, was the poor relative. It was a double-headed university. It had its main campus in the Bronx, overlooking the Hudson, and its song was, "Oh, grim gray palisades like a shadow above the Hudson." They were Ivy League wannabes, and they didn't make it. They were constantly denied. Hadn't a clue that they were sitting on a jewel in Washington Square Park. Most of the instructors and teachers were thin-lipped, pimply wasps that had graduated Bowdoin and all the Ivy League, and weren't kept there, and had to come down to New York to deal with the wops and the Jews and the blacks. They hated it, and we hated them, and they had nothing to contribute. There were a bunch of stars, wonderful professors that we gained something from. But the rest of our education was arguing among ourselves. And that's where I got to be a good friend of Nemirov's, who came from a wonderful family, the 1905 Russian Revolution. The people who had broken out of the ghettos and involved in Shakespeare and science and everything, from just the Jewish, whatever it is. And they were dedicated communists, and they were appreciators of poetry and everything. Really wonderful people. And I grew up with that family. It was a great close-knit family, for me and for them. Bob went on. He was a good-looking guy who, honestly, the worst issue was that he wasn't born black. He loved black. So his first wife was a spectacularly beautiful Puerto Rican woman who was unbelievably pretty and who became a duchess after she married Bob and divorced him. She went to Spain and became some duchess out there. She was then Lorraine, and then Jewel. And he really thought of himself as black. He had a wonderful flair for talent, and it wasn't just in Lorraine and other people, but Oscar Brown Jr. and a whole host of other people. He got a good ear. He worked for a while when he was married to Lorraine for Phil Rose, the producer of Grayson, who was a left-winger who grew up in Washington, D.C., and ran a record shop in Washington, he and his cousin. Came to New York. He had an eye for theater, and he wanted to expand, but he had a nice little record company doing what was called race records, black stuff. And he hired Bob at one point to find talent. Bob would come back with spectacular people, and Phil would say, nah, Carole King and Jerry Goffin, $500 to be exclusive, working for Phil Rose. All of us would have been multi-millionaires. Nah, I don't want to do that. A whole host of other people like that. And then, at one point, I left that part that Art had gone to law school, and after a year, both he and the law school agreed that it was a mismatch. And he left. And he started to drive a cab, do tree surgery, have an assistant. He became a union organizer for a left-wing union, United Electrical Workers, just wandered around.
Can we talk about Izzy Stone for a minute?
A what?
Izzy Stone?
I can't hear it.
Izzy Stone.
Izzy Stone, yes. At one point, Art got a job as a copy boy on the newspaper, not PM, The Compass. The Compass was the successor to PM, which is a very famous World War I newspaper which did not accept advertising, was sponsored by Marshall Fields, the department store heir, and featured wonderful commentary by Stone and a whole bunch of other people. When the war ended, Marshall Field didn't feel the need to subscribe to it anymore, and Ted Thackeray, who had been married to the heiress of the Schiff banking fortune and owned the New York Post and made her husband the publisher and the editor, got divorced, and he then raised money to open up his own newspaper, which also did not have any advertising, but not because it had a principle. Nobody advertised. Very small circulation, but it had Izzy Stone, wonderful sports commentary by the guy who had been the sports editor of the Herald Tribune. Other than that, all the news gathering was done by tuning into the radio and copying what the radio said and then putting it on the front page of the paper. And Art started out as a copy boy, but he was very interested in research, and he would read 16 papers and clip newspaper and put them together and make a story out of it. And he would present that to I.F. Stone, who would use it. So he was like I.F. Stone's researcher. And he got me the job as a copy boy, and I got promoted as a reporter, and we were ecstatic. We had a wonderful time, and then the paper closed. There was no readership. And I decided that this was the height of McCarthy era, that America was doomed to go fascist, and that I would never get a job in a newspaper again. So I decided that one of the places to hide was in medicine, but nobody wanted to bother. So I took another year and a half of pre-med at Brooklyn College and took the test and got into medical school. And Art went on in that period. Both of us were trying to figure out how do we support ourselves. And at one point, Art started, whatever it was, we said, Pete Seeger had just been in the Weavers, so it's a well-known name. We knew that there was a theater, the Circle in the Square, which had about 140 seats. So at midnight, we presented Pete Seeger at midnight at 140 seats. 3,000 people showed up at midnight. And Art and I said, we maybe got something there.
Now, what year was this? Do you remember? 55?
No, before.
Oh.
52, 53. And Art, and in partner, we started, and with Larry Moyer, you don't know Larry Moyer, a very interesting, funny character, who was a friend. We started to promote concerts of ex-Larry, Josh White, name people.
Larry Adler.
A whole bunch of
And then you guys did a bunch of Jamaican
Calypso at Carnegie. 2 years of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in the small Carnegie Recital Hall. Spectacular success. And Art started to represent Carlos Montoya, and we started to produce Mahalia Jackson and a whole bunch of people like that. And you had an office in the Midtown, and we were doing fine. I went to medical school. In the last year of medical school, Phil Rose asked us, Art was representing all kinds of talent, and I was being friends with Bob Nemiroff, and Bob was working for Phil Rose. And Phil Rose tried to branch out of his black music, and he had a young guy named Vince Martin, a very good-looking young guy. And he said, I'd like to make a record with him, see if Art has any talent. So Art produced the Terriers, Alan Arkin, Eric Darling, and another guy as the backup with Vince Martin. And then Bob and I were asked to write material because Vince Martin had no repertoire. So we wrote Cindy O Cindy. And driving in New England, I'm not sure why. I turn on the radio, and Cindy, oh Cindy, is on the radio. I almost went off the road. And that money, Art and I talked about it, said, why are we renting halls? Let's establish a place where we don't have to pay rent. So we went to the village that we knew. Both of us had gone to NYU. And there was this single occupancy hotel which had bums living in it all the way. And they had one bathroom to a floor, so the guys had bottles where they pissed in and they threw it out the window, and it would crash on Bleecker Street. And it was not a place where anybody went. We were able to get the basement, which had been the laundry for this big place, with a back door on Thompson Street and a gate. That was the gate. And we spent my last year of medical school, I took a 6-month hiatus, and the two of us tore out tons of laundry equipment and used the money to set the village gate open, and that was the village gate.
Can we backtrack a little bit? 'Cause
Yes.
you were telling me a story, and you can tell me what year this was, but before all this happened, you were looking for business ideas. You told me something about you tried to open a coffee house in Boston.
Yes.
You tried to convince this woman,
Yes.
and she almost went for it. Anyway, tell me the
No.
story, because I like this
I will
story.
tell you the story. We were probing for something to do, which was before we were producing the concert. And suddenly, the coffee house, the famous one, the Italian one, the first one, the
Cafe Chino or
no, the,
San Remo or Sangriai?
not the coffee shop up on Thompson Street. It's still there. It's whatever it is. Opened up, and it was an amazing success. Coffee was 5 cents, and they were charging 25 cents, and people would go in there. It was unbelievable. 5 times the value. And another coffee shop also opened, and that was doing good on Thompson Street. So we said, the New York market is surfeited at these 2 places. That's how smart we were. And Art had a girlfriend in Boston. So we went to Boston, and we started to walk around Boston, making note of all the corners in Cambridge that made a possible place. We have about 12 to 15 locations, and when we compared the telephone numbers, they all led to one place. So we called, and it was Bertha Cohen Realty, and she invited us to meet us at her office, which turned out to be in the basement of an apartment house where they stored the carriages, and we went back into there, and there was an office with a lady in black crinoline, high button shoes, pince-nez, with a comb. And we said, you own all those stores? And she said, yeah. And he said, what is it you guys are looking for? We're not going to give away our secret. So we kind of played and played. Finally, she aced it out of us. She said, coffee for 25 cents? Are you crazy? No, forget it. But they look like 2 bright Jewish kids. I have a store. I'm willing to back you in a delicatessen, a Jewish delicatessen on Commonwealth Avenue. Wow. The story behind that was that she had been the landlady for the best Jewish delicatessen, the Midget, on Commonwealth Avenue. He was tired of being screwed by her, so he bought a place and moved out. And she would not back 25-cent coffee, but she would put up $50,000-$60,000 for two Jewish kids to open up a competitive delicatessen to undercut the Midget. We didn't want to do that Jewish delicatessen, so we went back to New York.
Great. So how did you and Bob Nemiroff get together with Oscar Brown Jr.?
We were the same age. So
How did you get together with Oscar Brown Jr.?
with who?
Oscar Brown Jr.
After we had written the song